Hello everybody, welcome back to Stargirl Society, the podcast that inspires you to reclaim your power and start living the life of your dreams. I'm your host, Phoebe Goldsmith, and in today's episode, you join me from my bed, arguably my favourite place on earth, and I thought this was very appropriate given that some of you may be watching from your bed in the depths of despair. And I have been there. Today, we are going to be covering the topic of depression. The goal of this episode, first and foremost, is to make you feel like you are not alone. I want to cover my experience with depression, how having high functioning depression can make life really difficult and getting off that hamster wheel a lot harder, how my neurodivergence and my ADHD impacts depression, the medication that I've tried and my experience with that, pre-menstrual, cyclic depression, and also just the feeling of kind of constantly feeling depressed. And I will also share the tips that I have as well for you guys from my experience. If you like today's episode, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. You can follow if you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Make sure you turn on notifications so you never miss an upload from me. I will also make sure to link mental health resources in the description of this episode. So please check those out if you feel like you don't know where to turn. So starting off with my experience of depression. So as most teenagers do, I think I definitely suffered with some low mood, some burnout and some exhaustion in my early teens, which is pretty typical. But I think one thing that I have always noticed about myself is that I'm either very happy or very sad. I feel emotion very deeply and I always have. So I think I was not very often in that grey area of just like bad mood. I think from my young teenage years, as someone who is very perceptive, very aware and very emotional, I was always in a very deep existential place whenever I was faced with troubles. I am a thought daughter, and I think that being someone perceptive, emotionally intelligent, someone with a deeper outlook on life when you're coming into your teen years can be really difficult. Sometimes I wish I had a longer period of time where I was naive and didn't deep every single thing that happened. But that was pretty much my experience in my early teens, nothing crazy. But then going into my late teens, I'd say from about 16 onwards, that's when I started to deal with really bad pre-menstrual depression. We are going to cover PMS or PMDD a little bit later, but at the time I just remember feeling so confused because I would be fine, I'd be happy, life would be great, and then leading up to my period, like I just felt physically weighed down by feelings of depression and I couldn't understand why. I remember saying like, I don't think like a depressed person, I feel depressed, and that's something really difficult to go through, especially when it's out of your control. But I guess as most young girls and women do that are facing hormonal issues, we kind of just attempt to get through it. So that's what I did. And then in my early years at uni, that's when things really started to change. And that's when I felt like I experienced my first proper deep episode of depression. So I was in my first year, I was very happy, life was great, and then it came to the summer between first and second year where I started to experience really intense anxiety. I kept waking up in the middle of the night thinking I was literally dying. I had just this awful impending doom feeling a lot of the time. And then eventually when I started second year, there were a bunch of things that happened, which I will explain, that led me into what felt like the deep, dark pits of hell. I think for a lot of people who are naturally susceptible to depression, there are triggers, there are things that can lead you there. And then one thing will happen or a couple of things will happen and it creates the perfect storm. And then you fall into that really deep depression. And I think that's what happened for me. So I think I already had bad anxiety. I was in a toxic situationship that was really not good for me mentally and emotionally at the time. And I was dramatically undiagnosed with many issues in my life, ADHD, neurodivergence being one of them, as well as symptoms of OCD that I was facing. I went through something really difficult friendship-wise in the first term of my second year of uni, which sounds dramatic. I'm not really one for friendship drama. I wouldn't even say this was drama, like this was a whole life event that was extremely difficult. I then had a death in the family that was really sudden and unexpected. One of my cats also died, which just felt like the cherry on top. And it's funny because I don't remember the decline, but I went from this just like happy, full of life, hopeful first year student to someone who was constantly calling work, cancelling my shifts. I physically could not get out of bed. One thing about depression that I think people do not understand is that people think that you are, to an extent, being lazy and that you have autonomy and control over what your body and your mind does to an extent, and like you can get yourself out of it. When I was depressed, I would not have got out of bed if the house was on fire. And unless you have experienced that, you cannot understand the disconnect between your mind and your body. It feels like your mind and your soul have quite literally left your body, and you have no control over your body and also no control over your mind, and you're sitting in this like weird limbo phase where you just have no concept of like genuine reality anymore. And that can be really hard. And I think that that level of numb is something I've never experienced before. As I said, I would call into work sick, but like because I didn't realize how sick I was mentally, I didn't really feel like that was like a good enough reason to not go into work, which is crazy. My depression was also making me physically sick. So I'd get tonsillitis all the fucking time and I'd be telling them it was that, and I just could not cope. If you guys have watched my university advice episode, you may remember me talking about this, but I couldn't really feel like I could go to anything and sustain any kind of attention or soak any information in, or I'd go to the library and like need to sleep for like 3 hours after because I was so exhausted. I was sleeping all the time. But amongst all of this, I was functioning. And I think that's what people fail to understand. During this time is when I was probably complimented the most on having my life together. I was in cheer, I was in dance society, I was getting my degree, just about. I was still going out. Two things can be true at once with depression. You cannot be able to get out of bed or fathom doing anything. And then sometimes you somehow get swept up in the current of life and you're able to keep going. And I think functioning depression is one of the hardest things to get on top of, because to most people you're seemingly fine, and it's really only up to you or the people that spend a ridiculous amount of time with you that would necessarily know that anything was different to do something about what is happening. You know, if you literally bed rot for like a week straight, you don't brush your teeth, you don't eat, it's quite likely that somebody might notice at some point, but sadly that's not even the case for everyone. But when you're functioning, understandably, most people don't think that there is a cause for concern. We will go into more detail with some of my tips later on, but just as like context as to how I ended up getting out of that situation, I eventually managed to get myself to make a referral for myself with the wellbeing team from the GP, and I was able to speak to somebody, get some clarity. At the time, I was guided towards OCD therapy because that was definitely part of the problem, was just being unbelievably exhausted from every decision, everything I did, and this like hyper control I tried to have over my life. And little by little, through that therapy, things gradually started to get better. I had, an hour that was good every week, or then a day, and then those days turned into kind of weeks. And then after about 6 months after initially reaching out for help, I felt like I was somewhat stable. There was definitely a period of time where I had to like recover from being depressed. I think something not a lot of people talk about is the time you take after being depressed to actually reflect on what's happened. That was definitely a good few months of my life. You also live in fear that at any moment the penny's going to drop and you're going to fall back into that again. I think that the recovery period from depression can be equally draining and scary in its own ways. And my experience since that first big battle I had with depression has been, once again, periods of time where I felt very functioning, very on the cusp. I don't know if any of you have felt this way, where you kind of feel fine, but you also know that literally at the drop of a hat, you could completely fall into the abyss. Like you're sort of hanging on by a thread. I'm grateful to have not experienced depression to that extent since then, but there has been times where I feel like I've been functioning with symptoms of depression and this kind of just like dull ache of depression in my life. The wonderful thing about having experienced what I did is now I know what warning signs to look out for, which is when last summer in 2025, I sort of noticed that I could be getting to that place again. Work was really shit, elements of life felt really shit, and that is when I reached out to my GP to go on medication, which we will get to. I wanted now to touch on how neurodivergence affects depression. In my mind, there are two ways that the two things interact with one another. The first way being that we are more susceptible to depression, and the second way in that we are more likely to be misdiagnosed with depression or anxiety as opposed to getting to the root cause being neurodivergence. So my ADHD, my neurodivergence, was a missing piece of the puzzle that I managed to fit into place last summer. So I found out about my ADHD last summer, and now my experience of depression makes so much more sense. Firstly, because of my susceptibility to depression, the exhaustion neurodivergent people face in fitting into a world that was not designed for us was always gonna make me depressed. Because not only do you experience burnout because of this, you also experience this impending doom, this lack of hope from kind of knowing that the world is not going to change. All this energy I'm taking and that we put into fitting into this world and trying to make our brains work in a particular way feels like an uphill battle that we are never going to win. Equally, when neurodivergents approach people for help and they're explaining these feelings but they're not diagnosed, so they can't articulate it in the way that I just did, the obvious thing is to say, okay, anxiety, depression. And that further leads us to continue to only treat these surface level symptoms and not get to the bottom of things. So when I first experienced severe depression, it felt like it was all 20 years of my life being undiagnosed, masking my symptoms, coming to the surface and finally stopping me in my tracks. People will often say, why do you need a label? Why do you need a diagnosis? Because when you have ADHD, this is my experience, you can mask all you want. You can try and fit in all you want, but you will always crash because it's not sustainable, because it's not actually how our brains are working. And that is what I did for years of my life. And I couldn't understand why I was always ending up burnt out, depressed, with no hope about life. And finding out that I was neurodivergent, everything makes sense. And even though I have that missing piece of the puzzle, it still affects me because I still feel like this is never going to change because this is just how my brain is. But I'm working on it. I don't have all the answers, but I think it's a very important topic to speak about. And if anything I said really relates to you and your experience, then I would encourage you to look at your life and look at potential underlying issues because it can be extremely helpful. As I said, I was initially treated for OCD when I first got help for my depression. My symptoms of OCD were a reaction to my ADHD. It's a very common misdiagnosis or co-diagnosis. I can't remember what the official word is for that. For women with ADHD to be treated for OCD. Because I learned to mask my symptoms, that can sometimes manifest in this inescapable need for control, which then can come into like compulsions and OCD behaviors. I want to speak in a bit more depth about how difficult it is to be functioning while you're depressed. As I touched on before, you can have severe depression and still be functioning day to day. In my opinion, you don't have to not ever be able to leave your bed ever again to have severe depression. For me, attempting to continue to function whilst I was depressed was my way of punishing myself. Sometimes I think we are so in denial about how depressed we are that we force ourselves and punish ourselves by making ourselves continue in day-to-day life in the hopes that maybe it will help us snap out of it, that we will just suddenly become better. And also it stems from not wanting to ask for help and not wanting to alert anyone. And it can be extremely hard because I felt no matter how bad my depression was, that to an extent I would continue showing up in society as a regular citizen. So how am I ever going to get off this hamster wheel? And you also run into the problem that when you do open up to people about how you're feeling, naturally, I don't think people will think it's as bad as it is Because in their mind, they're like, okay, Phoebe's opened up about how she's feeling. I'm going to keep an eye on her. She seems to still be doing this. She seems to still be doing that. So like, let's see if it gets worse, which makes sense. But it isn't always true for depression. You'll see a lot of people who end up getting to the level where they need to be admitted to somewhere. And the day before, they went out to coffee with a friend, they showed up to work, and it makes things really, really hard when it comes to measuring depression, diagnosing depression, getting help if you are somebody who is high functioning. So if that is you, I just want to let you know that I see you and that it can be really, really difficult to know what to do in those situations. Let's talk about my experience with medication. So as I said, in the summer of last year, that is when I decided to go on medication. I was having a really hard time at work. And as I said, I started to notice the signs that I could slip deeper into a worse, more severe depressive state. And that is the last thing I wanted. I was always very opposed to medication. It just sort of freaks me out, scares me. I don't like it. I don't like the thought of losing myself to a medication or feeling out of control or like slowly but surely changing and not being aware of it. It's a big fear of mine. But at the time, I just felt like there wasn't any other option. So I spoke to my GP and, well, I say spoke, also cried, and ended up being signed off work to start a new medication. So I ended up starting on a low-dose antidepressant, and I can firmly say that I am extremely glad I did that because it made the world of a difference with the situation that I was in and still helps me to this day. So side effects that I experienced, the initial 2 to 4 weeks were quite weird for me. It is weird adapting to something new, especially something that is altering your brain. Even at a low dose, I did feel a bit just like spaced out, a bit weird, a bit hyper aware in a way that I'd never felt before. It can, in the first few weeks, make your depression and your experiences worse, that I had been told. So that's why I was signed off, and I think it's very important if you're starting a new medication that you speak to someone that you really trust and you let them know of the situation so that if things do worsen for you, you have somebody that you've already explained the situation to that can help you. And I would highly recommend not being in work when you're starting something like that. That is not the environment I needed to be in, probably not the one you need to be in either, especially if work is the problem. But yeah, so the first few weeks were a bit weird, and then after a while, I think around like the sort of 2-month mark, I started to notice a difference. And as I said, I am on a relatively low dose. Everything affects someone differently. So that's why I'm hesitant to say the exact medication I'm on, the exact dose I'm on. But just know that it's a pretty mainstream medication. It's a pretty standard low beginner dose of it. And what it does for me is provides me a safety net. If you remember from the beginning, I spoke about the fact that I really sometimes struggle throughout my life to not be an extreme level of sadness or an extreme level of happiness. I can't just exist in like a bad mood without it turning into me spiraling. There isn't levels to my unhappiness, if that makes sense. I just go straight to the bottom. What my medication really helps is adding a safety net at the really low level of negative sadness and unhappiness. So now I feel like for the first time in my life, when I'm in a bad mood, I sort of actually naturally start to fall down levels and a ladder for once instead of catapulting straight to the bottom. And if I feel like I get there, my medication sort of allows me to land on that safety net and bounce back up a lot quicker than I had before. I also did not want a strong dose because I didn't want to feel numb. I think although my deep emotional depth has often been my downfall, I love it and I don't know myself without emotion. And I don't want to be someone who goes through life without emotion because I think it's my biggest gift. So please just know if you feel the same that you don't have to go on something that's going to completely numb everything out necessarily. Your doctor, whoever you speak to, your healthcare professional will know what's best for you. And sometimes when things are really severe, that is what you need, I think, and that you sort of just need to cut that emotional pain. However, if you're looking to sort of function better on a day-to-day life, if you kind of feel like depression is only one bad event away or it's one bad day away, you feel like it's something that's kind of in the background, that you fear a lot, that you can slip into when you're burnt out with your menstrual cycle, then something at a low dose really helped me personally. Speaking of menstrual cycles, I did want to speak about premenstrual depression. Whether this is something you suffer with or something you don't, I think it's very important for everyone to be aware and be educated on how much this can really affect the lives of women. So I think if you are naturally susceptible to depression anyway, or mental health, also if you're neurodivergent, I was recently reading a book about this that was talking about the fact that neurodivergent women are more likely to suffer from PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder, I believe, or premenstrual depression. It can be really, really hard when you feel like you've spent the whole month working on yourself, being happy, everything seems to be going well, and then completely out of nowhere, you just suddenly feel like you're in the pits of hell and there's nothing you can do about it. And we're sort of taught and conditioned to just get through it. And even worse than that, people almost make fun of and make a joke out of women PMSing. Regular PMS and low mood is no joke, let alone depression that you experience premenstrually. And no, we don't always want to go on the pill for that. I have done that, but is that something I want to do long term? No. Not every woman should just be expected to go on hormonal contraception or go on antidepressants just to feel like she can get through life when premenstrual depression hits. Another reason I'm currently in bed talking to you guys is because I'm currently PMSing and I find this period really difficult. I was on the pill for on and off for a good 3.5 years, and I have recently decided to get back to my natural cycle, and boy has it been difficult. And that's what's kind of inspired me to add this section into depression, because you might be someone watching this right now who only feels depressed on their period or around their period or any point in their cycle. You feel this kind of surge. You might not relate to anything else I've said, but you might relate to this, and that is why I am saying it, because you are equally as valid to be heard in your feelings of depression as anybody else if you only experience it during your menstrual cycle. And I am sick to death of people minimizing the effects that women experience emotionally, physically. It's not just when you're bleeding, it is the entire month that there is ups and downs and everything in between. It's a cycle. It's not just the 7 days when you're having your period that we need to think about and that we need to factor into the lives of women. Okay, last thing that I wanted to speak about is my tips if you are feeling depressed. So obviously I'm not a professional. As I also said at the start, the main point of this episode was to allow people to feel validated more than anything. What works for me might not work for you. I don't have all the answers, but these are some things that sort of help me to feel better. Number one is to condition yourself out of being afraid to speak about depression to family members, friends, healthcare professionals, and your place of work. Although people joking about, oh, I just feel so depressed about this, so depressed about that, I'm guilty of that. The best thing I did for myself was to be able to stand up in front of someone and say, I am severely depressed and I don't know what to do about it. I'm such a stubborn person. I'm also very independent. So for me to do that, it's really difficult to admit that I couldn't find a solution for something. Like, my ego can't take it. But it is so important that you try your best to get out of that fear of saying these words to whoever, especially to friends and family who think you have it all together and you almost like that they think you have it all together. Standing in front of those people admitting that actually you literally are hanging on by a thread is very hard, but it will be very empowering for your journey. My next tip, which is huge as you come into that adult world with mental health problems or with depression, is to get time off work. Get signed off work. Mental health issues are health issues, so you can be signed off from work if you are struggling and you aren't really functioning at work. Your employment cannot discriminate against you because of that. And I was in a place when I needed to take time off of work where I quite frankly knew everything was going to fall apart when I wasn't there. And did it? Yes. Did I come back to all the stuff that I had missed and no one had done it? Yes. Which is a whole thing in and of itself. But I just couldn't bear it. I was like, I know they need me, but you know who needs me the most? Myself. So speak to your GP. Do not be ashamed of taking time out of work for your mental health. It's going to feel shit. It feels shit returning. People are asking you questions. People might message you, where are you? Whatever. But trust me, you need to break the cycle, and you need a circuit breaker when you're depressed. And like, work, I don't feel like it's just ever helping the situation. The obvious tips that I have is to potentially give medication a try and to seek therapy. So this is all something you can do through the NHS if you are in the UK, privately if that's something you would like to put your money towards. If you're fearful of medication like I was, just know like it won't last forever. If you don't like it, you can come off and your body naturally returns to a state of equilibrium. Like, you will return to normal if you don't like your medication. So I would always say it's worth just giving it a go, just giving a little try. You sort of get to the point where like you don't have anything to lose. So seek healthcare advice, and whatever they advise you or maybe think that you should try, just be open-minded and know that it will all be okay whether you stay on it or whether you don't. Therapy is an obvious one. I'm not going to bore you with the details of that. We all know that. I think it's less about me saying get therapy, more about taking the steps, because that step in and of itself, literally, you couldn't have forced me to do that at certain points. Like, there was no amount of money that could have made me do that because of the way depression feels. But I think it's just about finding a friend, one friend who you decide to confide in, or that you just say, can you sit with me? We're going to get out my laptop and we're going to make this referral. Even if, guys, one day you open up your laptop, you type in the name of your GP practice. You say, okay, cool. You give yourself a pat on the back, close your laptop. Next day, you go back, you click on the website and you find the area where you might make a mental health referral. Cool. Another pat on the back. Next day, you go back, you do the next step. That is the thing. It's about breaking things down into like really small, manageable amounts of work towards getting therapy or getting help. As I said, it's really good to have one friend that like knows the really ugly side of what you're going through. When you have it's one friend or one person, maybe it's even a personal tutor at uni, whoever you want, or someone anonymous through a source that you find for mental health. When you commit to just one person, everything feels a lot less daunting because you're like, one person knows, and that immediately feels like a relief just to get it out. And if all else fails, you know that there is one specific person who does know what you're going through and can help you ease the load. And then you don't have to tell anyone else. You really don't. And also the advice I gave about getting help and taking things really slowly can also be applied to day-to-day life. So when I initially was seeking help, somebody told me about the spoon theory, which I still to this day have yet to understand why it's spoons. But she was like, imagine you have 10 spoons. I seriously don't get it. But imagine you have 10 spoons and each day you have to budget how many spoons you can give out. So for example, getting out of bed, 1 spoon. Brushing your teeth, 1 spoon. And basically you can only give out 10. And this allows you to really strip back life to the things that you really, really need to do, and allows you to feel accomplished in what you're doing. If you're depressed and you're still having these crazy expectations on yourself on a day-to-day basis, you're never going to feel accomplished. Whereas if you reframe your mindset to the reality you're actually facing right now, although that can feel like a defeat, and you take things back to like, what can I actually do right now? Like, get out of bed, brush my teeth, 2 to 3 meals, and do the reverse to get back in bed, and just accept that that is what you're capable of right now, you will start to feel more accomplished. And also pausing in between each thing. So she said that if you're getting out of bed, like, lift up your back, wait a few seconds, take a few deep breaths, say, okay, cool, I've done that, well done. Put your feet on the ground, do the same thing, wait a few seconds, think about what is the literal next step. Next step is not getting therapy. Next step is not medication. Next step is not changing your life. Next step is standing up, right? It's about breaking things down into an extremely small, bite-sized things that you can achieve. And ultimately, I think I just want to make it known to everyone that is listening that you are not lazy. You are worthy. Even when you can't get out of bed and can't keep up with anything in your life, you are worthy of happiness, of love, and success. When you can't keep up with personal hygiene, when you can't keep up with your job, you are worthy in this life. Even when it feels like the world is not meant for you right now, you are worthy of being here. As I said, I will link some helpful mental health resources in the description of this episode. Please use them. Please reach out. Please get help if you feel like you need it. I cannot promise that the process is going to be quick, it's going to be easy, it's going to be enjoyable, but I absolutely promise you that it will create a positive domino effect in your life. I really hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. I hope you learned something. I hope you feel seen and heard. If you did like today's episode, you can follow our Instagram at Stargirl Society Pod and my TikTok at Phoebe Goldsmith. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe. Follow if you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you stayed to this point in the episode, comment down below the butterfly emoji. I love that emoji. I love you guys so much, and I'll see you next week in the next episode.